I'd now like to introduce our next speaker. She is a grade 12 student from St. Mary's in Tabor. Her name is Kathleen Gonzales, and she has very generously donated some time on this day off that she could be at home to share with us her journey. One of the connections that really struck me when I heard this was how music is so often thought of as a language, and now we get to hear Kathleen talk a little bit about her journey, which has a lot to do with language as well. Come on up, Kathleen.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Mrs. Legler approached me the other day asking me to do a presentation of why literacy was important. And in order to do that, I would have to tell you a little bit about myself. So, why don't we begin with where I was born and raised? I was born and raised in Iloilo, Philippines. My first language is Ilonggo, but I'm proficient in English and Tagalog as well. When I was 7, my family had immigrated into Canada. 3 weeks after, I was enrolled into school. On the topic of education, this is where my story begins. I would also like to point out that I have accumulated some pictures for you to enjoy as we go along. The first picture you see here on my right is the crest of my former institution. And on the left is a generated copy of what it would have been when I was going to school. It's a little bit different now. It's been a couple years. The name of my institution was called Filipino American School Town. You're probably wondering why it was called that. To simply put it, my school placed an importance in bridging the gap between Filipino and English. That meant emphasizing on the English language. Because of this, I had an advantage that most immigrants didn't have when coming to Canada. What you now see here is a typical example of what a Filipino school was like. A student reading a book on a wooden desk, a cultural festival, and an example of the uniform that I wore when I was younger. To put into perspective how fortunate I was when this situation came into play, imagine this. In kindergarten, you're expected to read and write in your native language. Then from grade 1 onwards, you now have to take a mandatory foreign language class. That meant that at least a period of your day is spent with your teacher speaking complete and utter gibberish to you until you catch on. In my case, I was encouraged to speak in English when I had a question to ask, all the while still learning the language. A majority of my subjects were also taught in English: science, math, history, etc. Teachers were also encouraged to interact with us in speaking English. Signs were posted in English, directions were given in English, complete and utter immersification. Eventually, it became routine for me to discern what was English and what was Ilonggo by sound, and was able to comprehend if I was spoken to in either language. In fact, I can still vaguely recall an argument I had with a fellow classmate between the word quite and quiet. I won, of course. All this would have not been possible had I not been enrolled into this institution. It was only because my family had dreams of relocating to Canada so that we could live as a whole. My mom at the time was working as a foreign worker, while my brother, dad, and I stayed behind. At a very young age, my mother made a tough but very brave decision for my future and my brother's future. Because of my parents' wish for us to have a better life, that meant that they wanted us to transition as easily as possible. So from the ripe age of 1, my brother and I had unknowingly been prepared to move to Canada. Instead of having us watch cartoons that would be dubbed in Tagalog like any normal child would have been in the Philippines, they made us watch movies in English. My mother sent us books and toys from Canada so that it would educate us. This would also explain my slight obsession as a child with Winnie the Pooh. It's safe to say that although it did help, it did nothing to quell my anxieties in a foreign environment. Enjoy the pictures. Being very young at the time and having to go to a different country for a new life, it was very daunting. At the time, there weren't any other Filipinos in my school, which made me feel very aware of my situation. I looked differently, I sounded differently, I thought differently, and behaved differently. But because of numerous amounts of support from not only my family, but from the community, my teachers, and my friends, and so on, I was able to communicate with others on a speaking language. Being a very social child, just speaking another's language wasn't enough for me. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to prove to others that I may be different, but I am just as good as you. So I went and sought out books. I interacted more. I participated in school events. I immersed myself in this new culture, challenging myself to new goals. Maybe a little too much sometimes. But nonetheless, I was always looking to better myself. With these new skills, I began to understand others on an emotional level, was able to comprehend a situation that was presented, and also was able to give my thoughts and opinions on certain matters. This was all done through my experience of what literacy was. By applying literacy to my social life, my education, and other everyday situations, I was able to interpret information on a level that allowed me to interact with others and involve myself in what was once a foreign environment. My understanding of the English language helped me transition into my new life. To this day, I think that being an ESL person is a label that I wear proudly. With that saying, I think that any other person who has had to overcome a challenge of learning English or any other language is an incredible feat. It not only educates others of the cultures of a nation, but it allows humans to evolve in character. I always like to think the world was created round so that all ends meet. Thank you for your time.